That's because. That's because a lot of people go shopping at Christmas. That's because a small child always needs its mother. That's because all people are selfish. That's because April didn't even look at me. That's because Banpo Bridge now has a fountain. That's because bat legs are perfectly evolved for dangling. That's because bigger players would knock down and hurt anyone who tried to dunk. That's because easy money is bullshit. That's because everyone else left at the end. That's because gold doesn't have intrinsic value. That's because Gray created his own production company. That's because he didn't think it through. That's because he flunked the test. That's because he had found one himself 9 years ago. That's because he put up some interesting photos on his homepage. That's because he wasn't invited. That's because he went drinking once more during the Asian Cup. That's because he works for Chicken Feed. That's because he's been using the stiff stuff. That's because his contract's been terminated. That's because his face is rarely on the movie screen. That's because his talent is incredible. That's because humans and dogs have similar tastes. That's because I always wanted to have a baby sister. That's because I can breathe out fire and smoke. That's because I didn't get enough sleep last night. That's because I didn't operate on the boy. That's because I didn't use a flash. That's because I don't expect anything from you. That's because I don't feel well. That's because I don't have a heart. That's because I don't want to do it again. That's because I gave it to her as a token of my affection. That's because I had a cold. That's because I had lots of fun in England with you. That's because I have to drive. That's because I just fleet at the moment. That's because I laughed so much. That's because I love you. That's because I used it for a down payment. That's because I want more catsup. That's because I want the day off. That's because I was eating garlic. That's because I was just grabbing some things out of the dryer, and it's static cling. That's because I wasn't trying to. That's because I worked out this morning. That's because I'm in front of them. That's because I'm lazy. That's because I'm only here on school holidays. That's because I'm wearing a dress that accents my boobs. That's because I'm wearing this loose shirt. That's because it doesn't exist yet. That's because it hasn't been built yet. That's because it hurts. That's because it is closely linked to a person's sleep cycle, eating habits, and mood. That's because it is fun to ride bicycles. That's because it is in English. That's because it is the only thing they do to make money. That's because it sells just one book title at a time. That's because it was too hot and humid inside the plant. That's because it wasn't properly regulated. That's because it would be bad for business. That's because it's a seam ripper. That's because it's a trick question. That's because it's only the end of the first movement. That's because it's where we keep our food. That's because it's written with a left hand. That's because I've been up drinking all night. That's because I've been working over 100 hours a week for the past month. My new boss is making my life miserable. That's because Joseph and Gizmo did not like each other. That's because Koreans really like to go to the movies. That's because it would be bad for business. That's because it's a seam ripper. That's because it's a trick question. That's because it's where we keep our food. That's because most of them have very big families. That's because most of these people do not get punished. That's because most sci-fi is terrible. That's because not offering enough money to attract qualified people. That's because of a low blood pressure. That's because of a newly developed smart diaper. That's because of her makeup. That's because of our sampling. That's because our nasal passages act as sound resonators. That's because Painter of the Wind is historical fiction. That's because Park is also a graduate school student. That's because people are nothing but tools to you. That's because people avoid doing something wrong in front of cameras. That's because people from Busan have a distinctive southern accent. That's because Scots play with passion. That's because seaweed is very slippery. That's because she doesn't speak English. That's because she is pigging out fattening food. That's because she likes him. That's because she mainly traveled by bus and on foot. That's because she wants chocolate pudding. That's because she's lying to save her skin. That's because Spain's deserts looked like the Old West. That's because students will be graded on it with results recorded on the student's report card. That's because sugar causes students to become overactive. That's because telling the truth can sometimes hurt the other person. That's because Tenzing did not know how to operate a camera. That's because the actor has begun his mandatory military service. That's because the car broken down. That's because the carpet was soiled. That's because the construction company used dynamite to blow it up. That's because the cost of raising a child is very burdensome. That's because the country is poor and has many hungry people. That's because the entire dog unit will soon be equipped with shoes. That's because the footwear will protect their paws. That's because the hem unraveled. That's because the Korean baseball organization limited the number of innings. That's because the rainbow came out. That's because the roots are pretty straightforward. That's because the shoes have a tiny computer chip. That's because the stream was lit up by lanterns. That's because the sun was not shining. That's because the world economy was doing poorly. That's because their eyes are very sensitive to light. That's because their nerves are probably deadened from being so stupid. That's because there has been a banana diet fad in that country. That's because there is very little water. That's because there was a spate of mentally ill people sticking babies and children with hypodermic needles on the subway. That's because they are losing their habitats. That's because they are more willing to give at this time of year. That's because they are so tall and unusual looking. That's because they buy plane tickets in bulk. That's because they do not use their eyes very much. That's because they don't tell you nothing around here. That's because they have to keep their body damp. That's because they look up to you. That's because they lowered the price. That's because they make hotel reservations in bulk. That's because they walk hand in hand with the devil. That's because they're making a lot of money. That's because this 13-month-old baby girl was born with her legs stuck together. 1-3. That's because this is a Korean restaurant. That's because this is not a typical case. That's because this issue is more complicated than it may first appear. That's because tigers and lions don't mate naturally. That's because today is Chobok, which marks the beginning of Sambok. That's because too many people will be against it. That's because we didn't expect that you are coming. That's because we didn't have a proper wedding. That's because we don't like sick people. That's because we had a bit of a falling out. That's because we purchase in large quantities, directly from the manufacturers. That's because we're all busy with our lives. That's because whooping cough is back. That's because Woods hurt his knee. That's because worldwide demand for crude oil keeps rising. That's because you and I are friends. That's because you believe human rights to be a political question, and not an ethical one. That's because you didn't want it. That's because you don't eat a proper breakfast before you leave the house. That's because you don't listen to me. That's because you don't need a will. That's because you don't talk about her. That's because you don't want to. That's because you have a few things to do now. That's because you have developed the feeling of Jung. That's because you haven't heard the best part yet. That's because you kissed up to all your teachers. That's because you let him do it. That's because you lied to me. That's because you only began a week ago. They'll give you more meaningful work in a while. That's because you played hooky last week. That's because you sat up late at night. That's because you set up unrealistic goals. That's because you spent 4 years ignoring me. That's because you want it all for yourself. That's because you yelled at me. That's because your barbecue chicken is so good. That's because your clothes are wet, silly. That's because you're a decent man. That's because you're always thinking too hard. That's because you're closer to you. That's because you're right next to the machine. That's because you're right next to the machine. Why don't we trade places? That's because you're up to your neck in work these days. That's because you're used to looking at you. That's because you've never been really hard up. That's because, even in the winter, insects are right under your nose. That's because